The sea was calm that morning, but nothing about the journey felt peaceful. 200 German women, nurses, clerks, radio operators, and wives pulled from garrison towns, stood shoulder to shoulder on the transport vessel as it cut across the Pacific. The air was thick with salt, fear, and the lingering echo of a war that had already taken everything from them. They had surrendered. But surrender did not erase the humiliation, nor the terror. To them, the ocean was not just water, it was a cold, endless stretch between their old world and whatever shadow waited in the land of the enemy. Whispers traveled among them like nervous birds. Americans are brutal. They hate us more than the Russians. We will never come home. Most of these women had never held a weapon. Many had spent the war behind typewriters or hospital beds. Yet the propaganda they had grown up with, posters showing enemy soldiers with claws, politicians promising that capture meant torment, gnawed at their minds like a disease, and among them sat Helene. A pale figure with gentle features, her hands folded over a thin blanket. Her eyes, soft, almost glass-like, stared into a horizon she could not see. Blind since childhood, she did not look out at the ocean like the others. She listened to waves striking steel, to boots pacing on deck, to muffled sobbing in the night from women who were once proud citizens of a Reich that promised glory and delivered ruin. Helene's world had always been darkness, but this darkness felt different, colder, heavier. Her cane rested across her knees, and every movement of the ship sent a tremor through her fingers. She had heard the rumors, too. Americans, they said, would treat them like animals, like trophies of war. She imagined faceless enemies waiting on the shore, cruel voices, rough hands, eyes full of hatred. She prayed silently, not for victory, not for rescue, but for dignity. For just a little dignity left in a world that seemed determined to humiliate the defeated. Meanwhile, the American soldiers aboard said little. They stood guard, watching the prisoners with blank expressions. Not angry, not sympathetic, simply disciplined, unreadable. That somehow frightened the women even more. Fear fed on silence, and uncertainty was its sharpest tooth. Night fell on the ship. The Pacific stretched beneath them like a sheet of ink, swallowing stars and hope alike. The women wrapped themselves in thin army blankets, trembling not from the wind, but from everything unknown. Helene lay quietly, her mind drifting. She remembered her home, apple trees in spring, the sound of her mother's piano, the laughter of a brother who would never return from the Eastern Front. War had taken her sight long ago. Then it took her country, then her family. Now it carried her across oceans, a captive to fate more than to soldiers. Footsteps approached. A guard paused nearby. She could sense the presence, hear the weight of a rifle shift. Helene stilled, unsure whether to speak or to pretend to sleep. A canteen of water was placed beside her silently. No words, no explanation, just a gesture. Small, unexpected. It confused her more than cruelty would have. She clutched the canteen like an anchor and whispered to the darkness, "Will they despise us or pity us?" No answer came, only the steady hum of engines pushing them farther from yesterday. In that moment, no one aboard knew what awaited in the port of San Francisco. Not the women who braced for punishment, not the soldiers assigned to guard the defeated, but soon, very soon, they would all learn a truth that wartime propaganda could not predict. Sometimes, in the ruins left by war, the most shocking thing is kindness. Dawn broke not with gunfire, but with gulls. Their cries circled above the transport ship as it slid toward the coastline, cutting through mist like a forgotten ghost of war. The women crowded the railings. Some leaned forward anxiously, others shrank back in dread. This was the moment they had feared. Enemy soil, San Francisco, a name whispered through propaganda like a threat. A fortress of capitalism, a nest of ruthless soldiers, a place where enemies vanished into misery. But the first thing they saw was light. The city did not snarl with cruelty. It glittered, golden sunrise over bridges and painted houses, a skyline untouched by bombings. No smoke, no ruins, no hunger etched into walls. To women who came from shattered towns, San Francisco looked impossibly whole. Helene could not see it, but she felt it. Warm sun on her face, a breeze carrying salt and the faint sweetness of bakery bread from the harbor. Voices, not barking orders but laughing, talking, alive. The ship slowed. Soldiers lined up. American flags fluttered, and the German women braced for harsh commands. Hands behind heads, shoves, humiliation. Instead, a calm voice spoke. "Please disembark in an orderly line. Medical officers are waiting, please." A word they had not expected. Boots thudded on wood as they stepped down the gangway. Where were the snarling guards? Where were the angry crowds throwing stones? Instead, there were nurses in clean uniforms. Doctors holding clipboards. Military police standing alert. Not with hatred, but with duty. One medic dipped a cloth in cold water and dabbed it gently on a prisoner's forehead. Another offered aspirin to a woman with trembling hands. These were not devils. They looked like men and women simply doing a job. Helene waited, cane in hand. She heard footsteps approach and stiffened. A male voice, not sharp but patient. "Miss, may I take your arm? We will guide you down. Guide, not drag. Not force." A strong hand steadied her elbow. She hesitated, then let herself lean into the stranger's support. With every step, expectation peeled away like fragile paper. The expectation of cruelty, of shame, of punishment. At the dock, American Red Cross volunteers handed out water and bread. Bread, soft, fresh, warm. Not the stale rations the women had grown used to. Some prisoners refused at first, convinced it was a trick, but hunger softened suspicion. Soon trembling fingers broke bread, and tears followed. A young woman beside Helene whispered, "They do not scream at us." Another answered in disbelief, "This is not how enemies treat prisoners." Yet here, on foreign soil, they were treated, not as beasts torn from a battlefield, but as human beings. Helene's guide spoke again. His voice was gentle, almost careful. "My name is Private James Carter. I'll help you through medical inspection." She clutched her cane tighter. "But why?" she asked, breath trembling. He hesitated as though the question itself hurt. "Because war is over for you now." For the first time in years, Helene felt something unexpected. Not hope. She was not ready for hope, but a crack in the darkness. As buses rolled in to take them to the camp, tents flapped quietly in the coastal wind. This was still captivity. They were still prisoners. Freedom was far away. Yet a whisper stirred through the ranks of weary women. If this is the enemy, then what have we been taught? No one knew what awaited them behind those camp gates. No one dared imagine kindness beyond the pier. But hearts that had been hardened by fear began to soften, just slightly, like frost in early spring. And somewhere among the orderly lines and the sun-drenched harbor docks, the seeds of a story unlike any battlefield tale were planted. Not of victory, not of surrender, but of humanity. Quiet, fragile, and wholly unprepared for what it might become. The women were housed in long wooden barracks, simple, orderly, unexpectedly clean. Rows of cots, wool blankets, steel lockers. Everything precise, controlled, predictable. The camp did not smile at them, but it did not snarl either. It watched. It counted. It maintained discipline without cruelty. Yet quiet did not erase fear. At night, whispers still clung to the corners like shadows. They are pretending. Soon they will show their true faces. Helene listened. Silence to her was never empty. It had texture, like cloth woven with breaths, footsteps, shifting bodies trying to sleep behind tense ribs. She lay on her cot, fingers tracing the worn wooden bead of her rosary, when it happened. A soft knock on the barrack door, a pause, then a guard calling gently, not commanding, "Miss Helene." Her name spoken clearly, respectfully. "Not prisoner, not you." The matron looked to Helene. "Someone is here for you." She hesitated before rising, hand tightening around her cane. Every step across the barrack floor echoed through her memory of the propaganda posters. The enemy has no mercy. The enemy knows only force. Yet when she reached the threshold, she heard only birds outside. And breathing, steady, patient, a voice she recognized from the pier. Warm, low, careful. "Private James Carter reporting for escort duty." Escort. Not command. Not custody. A strange courtesy in a place built on fences and rules. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To the camp infirmary," he replied. "They want to examine your vision again, to determine whether treatment is possible." Treatment. The word floated between them like a fragile promise she did not dare touch. For years she had been told blindness was her fate, a closed door, permanently shut. Now someone was trying to open it. James offered his arm but did not force it. She could feel the hesitation in his muscles, like a man approaching something sacred, afraid to break it. Slowly, she allowed her hand to rest in the crook of his elbow. With each step down the gravel path, she expected roughness. But his pace adjusted to hers. He warned her gently of each change in terrain. There's a slope here, a wooden step ahead. In the infirmary, doctors examined her eyes, soft lamplight, careful fingers, quiet voices. She did not understand every medical term, but she understood tone. These were not men studying a prisoner. They were physicians studying a patient, someone who mattered. When they finished, she sat on a bench in the cool hallway, cane resting across her lap. James waited beside her, not distant, not towering, just present. She asked softly, "Why do you help me?" He exhaled, and for the first time she heard fatigue in him, the kind soldiers carry long after homecoming. "My sister. She lost her sight when we were children," he said quietly. "I learned that sight isn't the only way to see someone." Silence thickened with meaning. No propaganda had prepared her for this. A guard whose experience reached across battle lines, across nations, across everything war tried to divide. When she returned to the barracks, some women questioned her. "What did they do? Did they hurt you?" But she only shook her head, voice trembling not with fear but confusion. "No, they were kind." Those words unsettled the room more than any injury could have. Kindness from the enemy did not fit into anyone's stories. It threatened the armor built around their hearts. As lights dimmed and curfew silence fell, Helene lay awake, hands clasped over her chest. She had expected cruelty. She had prepared for it. She had braced for humiliation, for harshness, for the cold iron hand of vengeance. Instead, she met a soldier who spoke softly, who guided gently, who sat with her in hallways of uncertainty as though she were not a defeated enemy, but simply a person. War had brought her darkness. Yet here, in a place she feared most, a faint warmth began to glow, small as the lone flame of a match in winter. She did not yet call it trust. She did not understand it, but something had shifted. And the worst part was not that she was no longer afraid, but that she was afraid of what kindness could awaken, because sometimes mercy can be the most disarming force of all. The days in camp followed a rhythm, quiet, orderly, strangely humane. Each morning, the German women were counted, fed, and assigned simple tasks. They washed laundry, tended small gardens, and mended uniforms that no longer smelled of battle. Routine replaced chaos. But for Helene, time had a different weight. She lived not by the clock, but by sound. The shuffle of boots, the echo of metal trays, the gentle hum of life inside the fences, and somewhere in that rhythm, she learned to recognize one particular step, James Carter, always walking at the same steady pace. Never in a hurry, never shouting. He began visiting the infirmary on his breaks, sometimes to deliver supplies, sometimes, Helene suspected, simply to talk. He brought books, old worn American novels with pages yellowed by salt air. And when the nurses finished their rounds, he would sit a short distance from her cot and begin to read aloud. His voice carried the warmth of an afternoon sun. Steady, unpretentious, sincere, Helene listened with her hands clasped, as if holding the words themselves. Through his reading, she began to see, not with her eyes, but with imagination, the laughter of children in a faraway meadow, the sound of trains gliding past autumn fields, the whisper of wind through pine trees in a place called Oregon. Images she could never truly witness came alive within her darkness. When the story ended one evening, she asked softly, "Do you ever tire of reading to a stranger?" James smiled. "You're not a stranger anymore." The words lingered long after he left. In the barracks, whispers began to stir. Some women accused her of weakness, of forgetting who they were. Others simply watched, silently curious, perhaps even envious of the guard who treated one of them with gentleness. But Helene could not explain what she felt. It wasn't affection, not yet. It was relief, to be spoken to without hatred, to be regarded as human again. At night, when the camp lights went out, she would trace her fingers over the pages James had read, feeling the rough paper, the grooves of printed ink, and imagine what the words might look like if she could see. For the first time, she began to think not of the world she lost, but of the world that still existed beyond her darkness, a world with music, stories, and kindness that war had tried to bury, but could not destroy. One afternoon, as James helped her walk back to her quarters, she asked, "What do you see when you look at me?" He hesitated, then answered, "Someone who hasn't given up." Her lips trembled, not from sadness, but from the shock of being seen, truly seen. From that day, something invisible grew between them. Not love, not yet, but a quiet thread of recognition, the kind that binds people who have both lost something they can never reclaim. Helene began to smile more often. The nurses noticed, even the matron did. There was light around her, though her eyes remained clouded, and perhaps that was what unsettled some of the other guards, that a prisoner, blind and defeated, could somehow carry hope more clearly than those who had won the war. As dusk fell over the Pacific, the sound of the American flag rippling above the camp mingled with the soft murmur of James's voice reading by lantern glow. The war outside had ended, but inside these fences another kind of battle had just begun. A quiet struggle between duty and compassion, between the ghosts of propaganda and the truth of human kindness. Helene could not see the light, yet everyone around her began to notice it, because sometimes light does not need eyes, only a heart willing to believe it's still there. Even in a place as calm as the camp had become, war never truly left. It lingered like a draft beneath a closed door, cold, persistent, impossible to ignore. The women worked, ate, prayed, and rested under a sky untouched by artillery. But their minds still lived in the ruins they came from. Nightmares breathed alongside them, grief slept beside their pillows, and fear whispered in every corner. In the dining hall, spoons scraped metal trays. Bread was passed, soup ladled, voices hushed. Civil life in captivity. Yet behind every quiet gesture, suspicion curled like smoke. Why do they treat us this way? Do they want us to forget who we are? This is trickery. It must be. Whispers spread fastest in places where truth had been starved. Helene walked with her cane, head tilted slightly as if listening for footsteps that existed only in her memory. She could not see the stares that followed her, but she felt them, sharp as needles. Some prisoners watched her with envy, others with resentment. To them, her connection to James was not kindness, it was betrayal. A German woman receiving gentle treatment from an American guard. War had conditioned them to expect cruelty, not compassion. And compassion, when you're not ready for it, becomes frightening. One night in the barracks, hushed voices trembled like dry leaves. She's getting special treatment. Maybe she talks. Maybe she tells them things. No German should grow comfortable here. The matron tried to silence the doubts, but fear feeds itself. Rumors need no proof, only wounds. And every woman there carried wounds invisible to the eye. Helene sat alone at the edge of her cot, feeling the fabric between her fingers. She spoke quietly, as if afraid the night itself might punish her for honesty. Why do they hate me for being grateful? No answer came, only silence, heavy as history. The next morning, as she exited the barracks, someone muttered under their breath, "Blind, but she sees treason clearly." The words cut deeper than a blade. She stopped walking, her breath caught, yet she did not cry, because tears, she learned long ago, are a luxury not meant for those forced to survive. When James arrived later with a book tucked under his arm, the atmosphere shifted. Conversation ceased, chairs creaked, eyes followed. He noticed the tension, the way the air felt charged, like thunder waiting to break. "Is everything all right?" he asked gently. Helene opened her lips, then closed them. A beat of hesitation. Then honesty escaped, trembling and fragile. "They think your kindness has a price." James looked away, jaw tight, torn between duty and something deeper he dared not name. "Kindness shouldn't be suspicious," he murmured. "War has made us expect punishment in every gentle hand." Helene lifted her face toward the sound of his voice. "War made us blind long before my eyes failed." For a moment, silence was not fear, but recognition. Shared, painful, human. Then footsteps approached, hard, decisive. A senior officer, A stern voice cut through the fragile calm. "Private Carter." A word. James stiffened. Helene's grip tightened on her cane. Whispers followed him as he walked away. Not of gratitude, but of warning, because the camp might tolerate mercy. But mercy, when noticed, becomes dangerous. That night, Helene lay awake, heart heavy. She no longer feared American cruelty. She feared something harder to defeat, the war still raging inside those who had survived it. Sometimes the loudest battles are fought without guns. Sometimes the most painful wounds are carved by quiet suspicion. And sometimes the greatest danger in a place once ruled by violence is learning to trust peace too soon. Morning sunlight slipped through the barracks windows, warm and golden. It rested on the prisoners' blankets, on the dust floating gently in the air, on the wire fences beyond the grass. It looked like peace, but for people shaped by war, peace can feel like a trick. The camp moved in calm routine. Laundry lines swayed. Wooden buckets thumped softly against knees, and the distant rumble of trucks reminded everyone that the world outside still marched forward. Helene walked slowly, guided by the gentle tap of her cane on packed earth. Her steps were measured now, not timid, not hurried, simply steady. A woman learning to exist again. She sat on a bench near the garden, where soil smelled rich and green things grew because no one had ordered them to die. Birds hopped in the grass. Women hung sheets to dry. A faint breeze carried the ocean's breath inland. It was a beautiful day, and yet every heartbeat held tension, like a violin string pulled too tight. Beauty felt suspicious. Stillness felt dangerous. For a POW, serenity was not relief, it was confusion. How was one meant to rest while memory screamed of bombs, rubble, and sirens? Then came the familiar sound of boots. Slow, unhurried, deliberate. James. He approached not as a guard, but as someone unsure if he was welcome. The air around him carried a quiet restraint, as if he knew that even kindness could be misread. "May I sit?" he asked softly. Helene nodded. She did not turn her head. She didn't need sight to sense his presence beside her. He placed a small object in her hands. Smooth, cool, leather binding, a book. Not to read. She could not. But to hold, to feel its weight, to understand that stories still existed in a world that once drowned in screams. She traced the spine with her fingers. "Another story?" His voice warmed, a gentler one. "About home, and fields, and sunlight, sunlight," she repeated. The word tasted bittersweet, he read. And as he did, time loosened its grip. The cadence of his voice brushed away the fences, the uniforms, the scars of borders and flags. For a little while, they were not prisoner and guard, just two souls breathing in the same gentle afternoon. A nurse passing by paused, smiling at the scene. A quiet friendship growing where war once commanded hate, but not all eyes softened. From the kitchen porch, a senior officer watched, jaw clenched, expression undecipherable. Mercy threatens discipline. Humanity complicates war's neat lines. Still, James continued reading. One hand rested casually over his knee, the other holding pages down against the breeze. Helene listened, and in her stillness there was peace, but also guilt. Suddenly she whispered, voice fragile as cracked glass, "Why do I feel like I'm doing something wrong?" James lowered the book. His reply came simple, honest, heavy. "Because the world taught us that comfort is undeserved after suffering." A beat of silence. Then Helene said softly, "I don't know how to live in calm anymore." He exhaled slowly, not a soldier's breath, but a man's. "Neither do I." The admission hung between them, unexpected and human. Beyond the fence line, American soldiers drilled in formation. Commands barked, boots marched. Duty marched with them. Yet here, on a quiet bench in a POW camp, peace dared to exist. Shy, trembling, defiant. When the reading ended, James stood. He hesitated, as though leaving might break something delicate. Then quietly, "Tomorrow I'll bring another story." Helene nodded. She did not smile, though her heart felt something close to it. Hope, faint, dangerous, alive. As he walked away, the officer who had been watching finally turned and disappeared inside. Peace always draws attention. Kindness always raises questions. The sun warmed Helene's face, but the warmth frightened her. It reminded her of a world that might still hold goodness, and goodness after war can feel like a forbidden feeling, like something one must hide in the shadows of memory, as if survival required loyalty to pain. But even soldiers and prisoners cannot silence nature forever. Even in captivity, seeds sprout. Even in darkness, something grows. On that bench, beneath an unguarded sky, a blind woman felt light, not with her eyes, but with the fragile, trembling courage of someone learning how to trust the world again. Rain came to the camp that week, soft, misting, steady. It blurred the horizon, turned the dirt paths into quiet rivers, and made the fences gleam like lines drawn between worlds that should never touch. To most of the prisoners, it was just another day to endure. But for Helene, the sound of rain became a kind of symphony, each drop echoing off tin roofs, steady and patient, like the beating of a heart too stubborn to stop. Inside the infirmary, the air smelled of wet uniforms and disinfectant. James stood by the window, the book still in his hand, unread. He had been summoned earlier that morning. Again, conversations behind closed doors. Whispers about boundaries and appearance. The officers had noticed. The camp had noticed. Mercy, they warned him, must not become sentiment. Duty must remain clean of feeling. He didn't argue. He just stood still, the rain tracing paths down the glass, and thought of the woman who had begun to smile again. That afternoon, he found her sitting near the infirmary stove, hands folded neatly on her lap, head tilted toward the sound of his boots. She smiled faintly. "You're late today," he hesitated. Something in his chest ached at the gentleness of her voice, how trust had quietly taken root in a place that was never meant to hold it. "I had a meeting," she nodded slowly. "About me?" He didn't answer, but silence was often louder than words. Helene lowered her face. "They think I've made you weak." James's reply came out sharper than he intended. "They think kindness makes men forget which side they're on." A pause stretched between them. Fragile, dangerous, necessary. "And do you?" she asked. He turned away. Rain pounded harder on the roof. "I think war has no use for love," he said quietly. "It breaks everything that doesn't serve it." For a long time, neither spoke. Only the crackle of the stove filled the silence. Helene's fingers brushed the edge of the chair, finding his sleeve by sound and memory. "Then let's not call it love," she whispered. "Let's call it remembering how to be human." He didn't pull away. But he didn't reach for her either. Two people bound by a line invisible but absolute. Duty on one side, feeling on the other. The rain outside softened. The camp returned to its rhythm. Orders, drills, mealtime bells. But something had changed. The following morning, guards escorted Helene and several other women to a new section of the compound. Officially, it was for reorganization. Unofficially, it was separation. Distance. The simplest solution to emotions that uniforms could not justify. From across the fence, James watched her go. She couldn't see him, but she paused mid-step as if sensing the weight of unseen eyes. "Goodbye, Private Carter," she said softly to the air. He wanted to reply, but the word goodbye felt too final, too cruel. He stood motionless until her figure disappeared into the gray haze of rain. Later, in the barracks, whispers spread again. Some said the guard had been transferred. Others said he'd been reprimanded. No one knew the truth. No one asked. But among the prisoners, something lingered. A rumor that an American guard had once treated a German captive like an equal, and that the army could forgive many things, except compassion that dared to look like affection. Because in war's arithmetic, love is always subtraction, something to be removed before it infects the order of things. Yet, even stripped of its name, what Helene and James shared refused to vanish. It lingered like the echo of rain on steel, reminding both that even in a world designed for obedience and hate, the heart sometimes forgets its orders. And for a fleeting moment, the enemy had stopped being the enemy. Autumn arrived quietly in California. The leaves outside the camp turned the color of rust, the wind colder, the ocean sharper. The war had been over for months, but for many, peace still felt like a rumor. One morning, the loudspeaker crackled, an announcement that silenced the entire camp. Repatriation orders confirmed. All remaining German civilian prisoners are to be returned to Europe within the week. For most women, it was a call to freedom. They wept, laughed, prayed. Home, whatever was left of it, was waiting. But for Helene, the word home had lost its meaning. Germany was no longer the place she remembered. The cities had fallen, the streets renamed, the people scattered. And somewhere within that broken homeland she would be sent, blind, uncertain, unready. She sat alone on her cot, tracing the grain of the wooden frame with her fingertips. Her world had once again become sound and memory. She could hear others packing, whispering, rehearsing the moment of departure. But in her chest a different ache grew, the ache of something unfinished. A familiar voice came to the barrack door, steady, hesitant. "Miss Helene, James." For a heartbeat she could not move. She turned toward the voice and smiled faintly, sadness curling around the edges. "They're sending us back," she said softly. "I know," he answered. "Orders came this morning." He stepped closer, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. In his hand was a small package, wrapped carefully in brown paper, tied with thin string. He placed it in her lap. "What is it?" she asked. "A book," he said quietly. "The one you liked most. I thought you might. Take a piece of it with you." She held the package as if it were something fragile and sacred. Her thumb brushed the string. "Will they let me keep it?" "No," he admitted. "But maybe they won't notice." A silence fell between them, full of all the words they could not say. No promises, no confessions, only the weight of understanding that some connections are meant to exist only within certain walls. "When you go home," James said finally, "tell them, not all of us were monsters." She tilted her head, her voice trembling. "And what should I tell them about you?" He paused, then answered with quiet resolve. "Tell them I tried to remember what peace looked like. Outside, buses idled in the rain. Names were called. Bags lifted. Orders repeated. The camp that had been a cage now became a threshold. When it was Helene's turn, James reached for her arm one last time. His hand hovered in the air, then withdrew. Touch once simple had become impossible. "Thank you," she whispered, "for letting me feel the world again." He swallowed hard. "Thank you for reminding me it still exists." As she walked toward the bus, guided by another soldier, she turned her face toward the sound of his voice, the only light she had ever known in this place. He watched her climb the steps, disappear into the rows of passengers, and vanish behind fogged glass. The door closed with a hollow thud. Engines roared. And just like that, the chapter ended. Back in her seat, Helene pressed the book to her chest, whispering the only prayer she knew. "May I never forget the kindness of an enemy." Outside the window, barbed wire blurred into rain streaks, and the camp grew smaller until it was gone. The bus carried her away, back to a homeland she could not see, and away from a stranger who had shown her more humanity than war had ever allowed. In the darkness behind her eyes, she saw his face not as an image, but as a presence, warm, steady, alive, because even blindness could not hide the truth she had learned. Sometimes the brightest light is not in sight, but in memory. Europe was scarred when she returned. Cities she once dreamed of visiting were skeletal silhouettes. Train stations echoed with the sounds of lives trying to restart. Every street smelled of ash and damp brick, as if the war had soaked into the very walls. Helene stepped off the transport ship into a homeland that no longer knew itself. She could not see the rubble, but she heard it, crunching beneath boots, rattling under wagon wheels, whispering in wind through shattered windows. Her cane tapped against cracked stone as she walked, guided by volunteers who struggled to smile. Homecoming should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like waking from one nightmare only to wander into another. Quiet, exhausted, haunted. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones. They asked where she had been, how she had lived, whether she had suffered. She offered simple answers. Never once did she speak his name. Not because she had forgotten, but because sometimes the most sacred truths survive only in silence. In a small room provided by relief services, she sat at a rough wooden desk. A single candle flickered. Paper lay before her, edges curled from humidity. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the pencil. No teacher guided her hand. No one dictated the words. She wrote from memory, slowly, deliberately, letter by letter. "Dear Private Carter, I do not know where this letter will go. Perhaps nowhere. Perhaps everywhere. She paused, breathing softly. Outside, distant voices echoed like ghosts in broken streets. They told us enemies are to be feared. But you were not an enemy. You were a moment of peace in a world still shaking from war. Her pencil scratched on. Not elegant. Not romantic. Just honest. I cannot see the world you live in, but I hope it is kinder than the one we both survived. She stopped to rest her wrist, then continued. You read to me when the world was silent. You guided me when fear was louder than guns. You reminded me that people do not always become what war tells them to be. A tear slid down her cheek, though she did not notice. Tears feel the same in any darkness. I do not know if you remember me, but I remember you each time sunlight touches my face, because even without sight, I know what light feels like. Her hand shook as she signed her name, not neatly, but sincerely. Helene, she folded the paper with deliberate care, as though folding a fragile memory. There was no address to write, no certainty, no path. She sealed it with hope alone. At the village post station, the clerk hesitated. No recipient? He asked gently. She shook her head. It will find its way, she whispered. And though he knew it likely wouldn't, he placed the envelope in the outgoing bin. Because sometimes the smallest kindnesses honor the greatest ones. Days passed, weeks, seasons. Helene continued her life, learning to navigate new streets. New voices, a new world rebuilding from ruin. But each evening she touched the empty corner of her desk, the place where that letter had once rested. And somewhere across an ocean, in a different land, perhaps a mail clerk paused over an unclaimed envelope. Perhaps not. The letter may have been lost, or it may have sat quietly in a drawer, waiting for someone to feel its weight and wonder. But whether delivered or forgotten, its purpose had already been fulfilled. It existed. It carried memory. It carried gratitude. Sometimes the most important letters are not meant to arrive, only to be written. And sometimes the greatest answers are found not in replies, but in the courage to send a piece of one's heart into the unknown. Time moved forward. Rubble was cleared. Buildings rose again. And nations stitched themselves back together with treaties, trials, and uneasy peace. The world wanted heroes and villains. Clean lines, simple truths. History prefers certainty, not gray edges where hearts soften in places they shouldn't. Stories like Helene's slipped quietly into the cracks between war reports and victory speeches. There were no photographs, no medals, no documents. Only memory, fragile as paper, stubborn as hope. Helene lived a quiet life in the years that followed. She worked with her hands, listened to church bells, learned the names of children who played in rebuilt streets. People knew her as the gentle woman with sightless eyes who hummed old melodies no one else recognized. They did not know those melodies came from a distant coastline, a camp fenced with wire and softened by unexpected grace, where an enemy soldier once turned pages for her and read sunlight into a dark world. Sometimes, when the wind blew a certain way, she would pause mid-step, believing for a moment she heard the cadence of an English voice, steady and warm, carrying a story across the ocean. And in America, far from European ruins, James Carter lived his own quiet after-war. Discipline replaced duty, then age replaced discipline. He rarely spoke of the conflict, not because he was ashamed, but because some chapters belong only to those who lived them. He kept one thing tucked away in an old footlocker, a small name tag printed in German, found near the infirmary the day she left. He never knew if it was hers, but he believed it was. He never answered a letter, for none ever came to his hands. Mail can be lost, or perhaps fate, that invisible editor of human stories, decided some words were meant only for the writer. Yet sometimes, sitting on a porch in late twilight, he would close his eyes and imagine a blind woman feeling sunlight on her face somewhere across the sea. And he would smile, not with regret, but with gratitude. They had met in war, but what passed between them was not war. No history book recorded it. No soldier's manual prepared them for it. It existed in a place deeper than victory or loss, in the thin, stubborn space where humanity survives even the darkest years. And perhaps that is why it mattered. Because most wars are remembered by who fired first and who surrendered last. But real peace, true peace, is built quietly by ordinary souls who dare, even for a moment, to see the enemy as human. Helene never regained her sight. She did not need to. She had seen the rarest thing a battlefield can produce: compassion unclaimed by politics or flags, a kindness without witness, a connection without name, a story that belonged to neither nation, only to two hearts that intersected when the world insisted they should not. And so it vanished from headlines, from textbooks, from archives, not forgotten, simply unwritten. But just because a story is never recorded does not mean it did not happen. Some histories are not built from ink and paper, but from memory, breath, and quiet defiance against hate. This is one of them, a chapter in the great unwritten book of humanity, where mercy endures longer than orders, and the smallest light can survive even the longest night. Not every war story belongs to victory. Some belong to grace. And sometimes the most powerful tales are the ones the world never knew it needed.